Hello everyone, welcome back to Horrifying Stories. I know a lot of you like to listen to these videos before falling asleep, and I'm here to help. Before you drift off, please leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Story 1. The town of Gravenhill had a secret buried in whispers, hidden behind the eerie silence of its outskirts. There, tucked away in a grove of dying trees, was the playground nobody spoke about, the forgotten playground. Its swings creaked even when there was no wind. Its merry-go-round spun without a push, and the slide, it was rumored that once you slid down, you never came back up the same person. Sarah, 15 years old and full of curiosity, had heard the stories from her grandmother. "Don't you ever go there," Sarah the old woman warned, her voice trembling. "That place eats your soul." But Sarah was defiant. She wasn't afraid of ghost stories. So on a gray Sunday evening, when the sky looked heavy with unshed tears, she decided to visit the playground with her younger brother, Danny. The path to the grove was overgrown with weeds and brambles that clung to their clothes as they pushed through. The air grew colder with every step, and a strange hush enveloped them. Even the birds didn't dare sing here. "Are we really going to this creepy place?" Danny whispered, clutching his sister's hand. "It's just a playground," Sarah replied. Though her voice wavered, she forced a smile. "Don't believe everything Grandma says." But when they reached the clearing, her confidence faltered. The playground stood in eerie silence, its rusted structures covered in vines. The swings swayed gently, as if moved by invisible hands. The merry-go-round spun lazily, creaking with a sound that made their skin crawl. "I don't like this," Danny muttered, tugging at her arm. "Let's go home." "Don't be such a baby," Sarah snapped, though her own fear gnawed at her insides. "We came all this way. Let's look around." She approached the slide first. It loomed like a shadow, its surface slick with some unidentifiable substance. The bottom of the slide disappeared into a patch of darkness that seemed deeper than it should have been. "Sarah," Danny said again, his voice trembling. "Something's wrong." "Stay here," she ordered, stepping closer to the slide. As she touched the cold metal, a chill shot through her arm, freezing her to the bone. She pulled back with a gasp. Suddenly, the air around them shifted. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of wailing children. Then she heard it, a laugh, high-pitched and shrill. It echoed through the playground, making her blood run cold. Danny clung to her, his small hands digging into her arm. "Who's there?" Sarah called, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. The laughter stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. And then, a voice, a child's voice, soft and melodic. "Come play with us." Sarah spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the playground was empty. The swings, the merry-go-round, even the slide, all still now, as if waiting. "Sarah," Danny cried, pulling her back. "Look." She turned just in time to see a shadow dart across the playground. It was small, childlike, but it moved unnaturally fast. Her heart pounded in her chest. "We're leaving," she said firmly, grabbing Danny's hand. But as they turned to go, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The path they had come from was gone, replaced by a wall of trees that seemed to have moved closer, trapping them. "Stay," the voice whispered again, and this time, it was right behind her. Sarah whipped around and froze. Standing on the slide was a little girl. Her dress was tattered, her face pale and hollow. But it was her eyes that terrified Sarah. They were pitch black, voids that seemed to pull you in. "Play with us," the girl said, a twisted smile spreading across her face. "No," Danny screamed, and the sound seemed to snap Sarah out of her trance. She yanked him away, running toward the merry-go-round. But the playground came alive. The swings whipped through the air, chains screeching. The merry-go-round spun faster and faster, a whirlwind of rust and metal. The slide groaned, its surface splitting open to reveal a dark abyss. Sarah, Danny cried, tripping over a root. She grabbed him, pulling him to his feet, but the ground seemed to ripple beneath them. Stay, the voices screamed now, no longer just the little girls. There were dozens of them, children's voices, crying, laughing, begging. Sarah and Danny ran, dodging the swings and the spinning merry-go-round. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching out like hands trying to grab them. Just when Sarah thought they were doomed, she saw a faint light in the distance. "Run, Danny," she yelled, dragging him toward the light. The voices grew louder, angrier, but they didn't stop. They burst through the wall of trees, collapsing onto the grass on the other side. When Sarah looked back, the playground was gone. The grove was silent, empty, as if nothing had ever been there. Danny sobbed into her shoulder, and she held him tight, tears streaming down her face. They never spoke about the playground again. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah could still hear the laughter in her dreams. Story 2. The abandoned house at the end of Willow Street had been the subject of countless ghost stories in the small town of Eldermoor. Its windows were shattered, its roof sagged, and ivy crawled up its cracked walls like veins on a corpse. No one dared step inside, not even the bravest kids in town. They all knew the rumors the house whispered. It wasn't just the usual creaks and groans of an old building either. People claimed the house spoke to them, calling their names, luring them in. And those who entered, they were never the same. But to 16-year-old Clara, the stories were nothing more than exaggerated folklore meant to scare children. She was different. Logical, rational, and endlessly curious, she decided one chilly autumn evening that she would prove everyone wrong. Her best friend Mark was less enthusiastic. "This is a bad idea," he said, clutching his flashlight like it was a lifeline. "Why do you want to go in there? You know the stories." "Because they're just stories," Clara replied, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. The wind howled, sending leaves swirling around their feet. "Come on, Mark. Don't you want to know the truth?" "No, I want to stay alive," he muttered, but followed her anyway. He always did. The gate to the property was rusted shut, so they climbed over it, landing with soft thuds on the overgrown grass. The house loomed before them, its silhouette jagged and menacing against the moonlit sky. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine, but shook it off. She couldn't afford to let her imagination get the better of her. "Let's go," she said, striding toward the front door. Mark hesitated, his eyes scanning the windows. "I think I saw something move up there." "It's just your reflection," Clara said, though she didn't look up. The stories were starting to get to her, too, but she wasn't about to admit it. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. The air inside was stale, heavy, as if the house were holding its breath. Dust hung in the air, glittering faintly in the beam of Mark's flashlight. "See, just an old house," Clara said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. The silence was oppressive, pressing against her ears like cotton. They stepped into the foyer, their footsteps muffled by layers of grime and debris. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges to reveal dark stains beneath. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister broken in places. "Can we go now?" Mark whispered, his flashlight flickering. "Not yet," Clara said, venturing further into the house. She wanted proof, something tangible to debunk the rumors once and for all. They entered the living room, where a moth-eaten couch sat beneath a cracked chandelier. A fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and empty. But what drew Clara's attention was the mirror above the mantel. It was pristine, untouched by the decay that plagued the rest of the house. "That's ... weird," she muttered, stepping closer. "Clara..." "Don't," Mark said, his voice shaking. But she didn't listen. She stared into the mirror, her reflection staring back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, she noticed the faintest movement behind her. "Mark," she said slowly, "is there someone behind me?" "No," he whispered, backing away. "But I think we should leave. Now." The whisper came then, soft and chilling, like a breath against her ear. "Clara." She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Mark nodded, his face pale. "It said your name." The whisper came again, louder this time. "Clara ... stay." The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching and twisting. The air grew colder, biting at their skin. The mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble. "Run," Mark said, grabbing her arm. But Clara couldn't move. Her reflection was no longer her own. The figure in the mirror smiled, its teeth sharp and glinting. Its eyes were black voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. "Clara, let's go," Mark shouted, yanking her away from the mirror. The spell broke, and she stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The house erupted in whispers then, a cacophony of voices rising and falling, overlapping in a language they couldn't understand. The walls seemed to pulse, the floorboards trembling beneath their feet. They ran, the whispers chasing them, growing louder with each step. The house didn't want them to leave. The front door slammed shut as they reached it, the force of it rattling the windows. Mark threw himself against it, trying to wrench it open, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me," he yelled, and Clara joined him, her hands trembling as she pushed against the door. The whispers reached a fever pitch, screaming now, their words intelligible at last. "Stay with us." With one final shove, the door flew open, and they tumbled out onto the lawn. The whispers stopped abruptly, cut off like a radio switched off. The silence was deafening. They didn't stop running until they were halfway down the street, their breaths coming in sharp, painful gasps. Only then did they dare look back. The house stood silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. But Clara knew better. She could still feel the whispers crawling under her skin, echoing in her mind. And when she looked at Mark, she saw it in his eyes too. The house wasn't done with them. Story 3. The Pinecrest Woods stretched endlessly beyond the town of Ravenshollow, a sprawling sea of ancient trees shrouded in perpetual mist. The townsfolk spoke of the woods in hushed tones, warning travelers to stay clear. The woods remember, they'd say cryptically, their eyes darting to the treeline as if afraid to linger too long. When 17-year-old Sophie moved to Ravenshollow with her parents, she scoffed at the tales. To her, they were nothing more than the ramblings of superstitious villagers. She loved the woods. They were a sanctuary, a place to escape the suffocating expectations of her overbearing parents and the whispers of judgmental neighbors. But the Pinecrest Woods were different. They felt alive, as if the trees watched her every move, their twisted branches like outstretched fingers. The air was always heavy, thick with an earthy smell that clung to her skin. It was on a cold October afternoon that Sophie first heard the echoes. She was walking along a narrow path, her boots crunching on the frost-kissed leaves, when a faint voice called out from the trees. "Sophie." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling slightly. The woods were silent. She shook her head, convincing herself it was just the wind, and continued walking. But the voice came again, louder this time. "Sophie, help me." A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't just any voice, it was her mother's. She called, her voice rising with panic. She hadn't told her mother where she was going, and there was no way she would have followed her into the woods. The voice called again, desperate now. "Sophie, please." Without thinking, she veered off the path, pushing through the underbrush toward the sound. The branches snagged her coat, scratching her skin, but she didn't stop. The voice was leading her deeper into the woods, away from the safety of the trail. "Sophie, hurry." The trees grew denser, their trunks gnarled and blackened as if burned. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. She stumbled into a small clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The voice had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that made her ears ring. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice trembling. A figure stepped out from behind a tree. At first she thought it was her mother, but as it drew closer, She realized with mounting horror that it wasn't. The thing wore her mother's face, but it was wrong twisted, too pale, with eyes that were black pits. Its smile stretched too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Help me, Sophie," it said, its voice a grotesque parody of her mother's. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're not my mom," she whispered. The thing tilted its head, the smile never faltering. "Why are you scared, Sophie? Don't you love your mother?" It stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Sophie turned and ran, her legs burning as she sprinted through the trees. The thing's laughter echoed behind her, high-pitched and manic. "Come back, Sophie. Don't you want to help me?" She didn't look back, too afraid of what she might see. The woods seemed to close in around her, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at her hair and clothes. Her foot caught on a root, and she went down hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She scrambled to her feet, but the thing was already there, looming over her with its grotesque smile. "Stay with me," it hissed, reaching for her with hands that were too long, too thin. She screamed, throwing a handful of dirt into its face. It recoiled, shrieking, and she took the opportunity to run. The trees seemed to blur as she ran, the landscape twisting and changing. She couldn't tell if she was going deeper into the woods or finding her way out. The thing's voice followed her, whispering now, soft and seductive. "Sophie, you can't escape. The woods remember." She burst out of the tree line and into the backyard of her house, collapsing onto the ground. The world felt too bright, too loud, and for a moment she thought she might still be trapped in the woods. But when she looked back, the woods were silent, the shadows still. Her parents found her an hour later, huddled on the porch and shaking. She tried to tell them what had happened, but they dismissed it as an overactive imagination. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again, the voice, soft and insistent. "Sophie, help me." Her blood ran cold. The woods weren't done with her. The voice didn't stop that night. It called to Sophie, whispering her name over and over until her nerves were frayed. She buried her head under the pillow, trying to block it out, but the sound seeped through, chilling her to the bone. By morning, her resolve was shattered. She couldn't take it anymore. She needed to understand what the woods wanted from her. Sophie decided to visit Old Man Garrett, the town's unofficial historian and a reclusive man who lived on the outskirts of Ravenshollow. The villagers said he knew more about Pinecrest Woods than anyone else, though most were too afraid to ask. When Sophie knocked on his door, it creaked open slightly, revealing the dim interior of the house. "Come in," a gravelly voice called from inside. Garrett was hunched over a desk cluttered with books and maps, his gray hair wild and unkempt. He glanced up at Sophie with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "You've been in the woods," he said without preamble. Sophie nodded, her throat dry. "Something's calling me. It sounds like my mom, but it's not her." Garrett's face darkened, and he gestured for her to sit. "You've woken them," he said grimly. "Woken who?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "The echoes," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They're the voices of those who've been claimed by the woods. Trapped spirits, twisted into something unnatural. They mimic the voices of the living to lure more souls into their grasp." Sophie's stomach churned. "Why me? I didn't do anything." Garrett sighed. "The woods have a memory, girl. They hold grudges, feed on pain and fear. Someone in your family must have wronged them, and now they've set their sights on you." "What can I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a way to quiet them," Garrett said, his tone grave. "But it's dangerous. You'll need to confront the heart of the woods, the place where the echoes are strongest. There you might be able to bargain with them or banish them for good." Sophie hesitated. The thought of returning to the woods filled her with dread, but she knew she had no choice. The voices wouldn't stop until they had her. Garrett handed her a small vial of black liquid. "This will protect you temporarily. Smear it on your skin before you go in. And whatever you do, don't listen to the voices. They'll try to break you, but you have to stay strong." That night, armed with the vial and a flashlight, Sophie stepped back into the Pinecrest Woods. The trees seemed even darker than before, their twisted branches reaching for her like skeletal hands. She smeared the liquid on her arms and face, shuddering at its cold, sticky texture. The voices started almost immediately. whispering her name, pleading for her help. She clenched her fists and kept walking, focusing on the path ahead. As she ventured deeper, the forest began to change. The ground became spongy, the air heavy with the stench of decay. The trees were no longer trees, but blackened, gnarled shapes that oozed a thick, tar-like substance. Finally, she reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive tree. Its trunk split open to reveal a glowing, pulsating heart. The air around it was thick with whispers, hundreds of voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Sophie stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I'm here," she shouted. "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, a figure emerged from the tree, its form shifting and flickering like a shadow in the wind. "You," it said in a voice that was both many in one. "You carry the blood of the one who betrayed us." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sophie said, her voice shaking. The figure laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "Your ancestor. She cut down our kin, spilled their lifeblood into the earth, and now we demand retribution." "What do you want me to do?" Sophie asked. "You give yourself to us," the figure said. "Join the echoes and the debt will be paid." Sophie took a step back, her mind racing. There has to be another way. The figure loomed closer, its face twisting into her own. "There is no other way. You cannot escape us." Sophie clenched her fists, a surge of defiance rising within her. "I won't let you take me," she said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a matchbook Garrett had given her. "If you want my blood, you'll have to burn for it." Before the figure could react, she struck a match and threw it at the tree. The flames caught instantly, spreading up the trunk with unnatural speed. The voices rose in a deafening scream as the heart of the woods began to burn. Sophie ran, the flames illuminating her path as the forest came alive with writhing shadows. The voices clawed at her mind, but she kept running until she burst out of the woods and into the safety of her backyard. When she turned to look back, the flames were gone, and the woods were silent. For the first time in weeks, Sophie slept peacefully. The echoes were gone, their whispers silenced. But deep in the heart of the woods, beneath the charred remains of the tree, something stirred. The woods never forgot, and they never forgave. The stillness that followed Sophie's escape lingered for weeks. Raven's Hollow seemed quieter, almost too quiet, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Sophie did her best to move on, convincing herself that the flames had cleansed the evil from Pinecrest Woods for good, but deep down she knew better. Her dreams became the first warning. At first they were subtle, a sense of being watched, whispers just beyond comprehension. But then, they became more vivid. She saw the charred tree in the heart of the forest, its glowing heart pulsing faintly beneath the ash. The figure of shifting shadows stood at its base, staring at her with eyes like dying embers. Each morning, Sophie woke drenched in sweat, the dream etched into her mind. The whispers returned soon after. They weren't as loud as before, but they were there, lurking at the edges of her hearing. They no longer called her name, but they carried a different message now. It isn't over. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophie found herself drawn to her bedroom window. The woods loomed in the distance, their outlines stark against the fading light. She stared at them, her chest tightening as she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A single tree stood taller than the rest, its branches stretching upward like skeletal arms. It hadn't been there before, she was sure of it. It almost seemed to lean toward her, as if beckoning her back. She tried to shake the feeling, to convince herself it was her imagination, but the whispers grew louder that night. They weren't just in her mind anymore. They echoed through her house, rattling the walls and seeping under the doors. Desperate for answers, Sophie returned to Old Man Garrett the next day. His house felt colder, darker, as if the shadows had crept in to stay. "They're back," she said, her voice trembling. Garrett's face paled. "That's impossible. You destroyed the heart. They should be gone." "They're not," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "I can feel them, hear them. And there's a tree, it wasn't there before." Garrett's hands trembled as he reached for one of his ancient books. He flipped through the brittle pages, muttering to an they. "There's a legend," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The woods can be reborn if their roots remain. Destroying the heart wasn't enough, you have to destroy the roots too." "How?" Sophie asked, dread pooling in her stomach. Garrett closed the book, and looked at her with haunted eyes. "You'll have to go back." Sophie's breath hitched. "I barely made it out last time. What if they—" "They'll be stronger now," Garrett interrupted, "and angrier. But if you don't stop them, they'll spread. The whole town could fall to them." Sophie knew he was right. The whispers had already begun to creep into the edges of Raven's Hollow. Strange occurrences reported by neighbors, objects moving on their own, unexplainable chills, shadows shifting where there shouldn't be any. That night, armed with Garrett's guidance and a bundle of tools, Sophie returned to the woods. This time she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her town. The air was colder than before, the darkness thicker. The forest seemed to pulse with a life of its own, each step drawing her closer to the source of its power. As she reached the clearing, she saw the tall tree from her dreams, its bark blackened and its branches glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. At its base, the ash of the old heart still smoldered, a faint red glow emanating from within. The whispers erupted into a cacophony, drowning out her thoughts. The shadowy figure emerged once more, its form even darker and more defined than before. "You dare return?" it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "I'm not afraid of you," Sophie said, though her trembling hands betrayed her. The figure laughed, a sound like rustling leaves and breaking bones. "You should be. This time you won't leave." The ground beneath her feet began to shift, roots snaking toward her like living creatures. Sophie dodged, narrowly avoiding being ensnared, and swung the axe Garrett had given her at the nearest root. The wood screamed as the blade bit into it, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. The tree seemed to recoil, its glowing branches dimming for a moment. But the shadowy figure was relentless. It lunged at her, its form shifting and writhing. Sophie stumbled backward, swinging the axe wildly to keep it at bay. "You can't stop us," the figure roared. "We are eternal." Sophie gritted her teeth, her fear giving way to determination. Not anymore. She reached into her bag and pulled out a container of gasoline, dousing the base of the tree and the surrounding roots. The figure howled in rage, its form flickering as it tried to stop her. With shaking hands, Sophie struck a match and threw it onto the tree. The flames roared to life, consuming the blackened bark and racing up the glowing branches. The screams were deafening, the whispers turning into a single, agonized wail. The ground shook violently, but Sophie stood her ground, watching as the tree and the figure burned away to nothing. When the flames finally died, the clearing was silent. The oppressive weight of the woods was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. Sophie stumbled out of the forest as the first rays of dawn broke through the sky. She knew the battle was over, but the scars it left behind would stay with her forever. Raven's Hollow was safe for now, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep in the earth, the roots were still waiting. Story 4. The first snow of the season blanketed the small town of East Hollow in an eerie silence. Amanda Parker, a freelance journalist, arrived at the edge of town with a mission to investigate the long-abandoned Ashwood Asylum. The asylum had been a place of whispered legends and childhood dares, a looming shadow of East Hollow's past. Amanda's interest in Ashwood wasn't born out of idle curiosity. Her grandmother, Ruth Parker, had been one of the last patients admitted before the asylum was abruptly shut down in the 1950s. Ruth had spoken little about her time there, but her fragmented accounts screams in the night, doctors with hollow eyes, and shadows that moved on their own had left Amanda with more questions than answers. As Amanda approached the asylum, she felt the weight of its presence. The massive, decaying structure stood like a sentinel, its broken windows staring out like empty eyes. Vines crept up its walls, and the iron gates, rusted and barely hanging on their hinges, groaned as she pushed them open. Inside, the air was colder, as if the asylum itself had trapped the chill of decades. Amanda's flashlight cast long, flickering shadows on the peeling walls. The sound of her boots echoed eerily in the vast, empty halls. She began her investigation methodically, photographing the graffiti-scarred walls and the remnants of forgotten lives, shattered furniture, discarded medical equipment, and even a few patient records scattered across the floor. But it wasn't long before she felt the sensation of being watched. At first, she dismissed it as nerves, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing minute. In the old patient records room, Amanda found what she had been looking for, a file labeled Ruth Parker. She opened it with trembling hands, reading about her grandmother's admittance for acute paranoia and hallucinations. But what chilled her most was the final note scrawled at the bottom of the file. Patient claims to see figures in the dark. Insists they speak to her, urging her to stay silent. Termination recommended. Amanda's blood ran cold. Termination? Her grandmother had been discharged, hadn't she? The record said otherwise. A sudden noise broke the silence, a faint scraping sound, like nails on stone. Amanda froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the scraping, now accompanied by soft whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Amanda swung her flashlight toward the hallway, but the beam of light flickered, threatening to go out. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something, a figure at the end of the corridor, standing unnaturally still. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. The figure didn't move. Summoning her courage, Amanda took a step forward and then another. But as she approached, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows. Her instinct screamed at her to leave, but she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. She made her way to the basement, where the asylum's most dangerous secrets were said to be buried. The air grew heavier as she descended, the smell of damp and decay filling her nostrils. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't quite understand. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a room lined with old metal doors. Each door had a small, barred window, and through them she could see rows of empty cells. Empty, except for one. Amanda's flashlight illuminated a figure sitting in the farthest cell, its back to her. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothing, his head bowed. "Hey," she called out. "What are you doing here?" The man didn't respond. Amanda approached cautiously, peering through the bars. "Are you okay?" The man turned his head slowly, and Amanda gasped. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and black. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as he whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The lights in the basement flickered violently, and the whispers erupted into screams. The cell doors slammed open, one after another, releasing figures that weren't human, twisted and contorted. They crawled and shuffled toward her, their eyes glowing with malevolence. Amanda bolted, her heart pounding as she sprinted up the stairs. The shadows seemed to stretch and reach for her, cold fingers brushing against her skin. She burst into the main hall, but the asylum was no longer as she had entered it. The walls seemed to close in, the corridors twisting and turning into an endless labyrinth. A voice boomed through the asylum, deep and guttural. "You came seeking answers, Amanda Parker. Now, you'll join them." "No," she screamed, her voice cracking. She ran blindly, her flashlight flickering out completely. The darkness was alive, pressing in on her, suffocating her. She felt hands, dozens of them, grabbing at her, pulling her toward the shadows. In a final act of desperation, Amanda pulled out her phone and activated the camera flash. The sudden burst of light illuminated the hallway, revealing the grotesque figures closing in on her. But then, she saw a door at the end of the hall, faintly glowing. She sprinted toward it, ignoring the screams and the hands clawing at her. She reached the door and threw it open, collapsing onto the snow-covered ground outside. The cold air stung her skin, but it was a relief compared to the oppressive darkness of the asylum. When she turned back, the asylum was gone. In its place was an empty field, as if it had never existed. Amanda's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at the spot where the asylum had stood. She clutched her grandmother's file tightly, the only proof that any of it had been real. But as she stood there, she realized the whispers hadn't stopped. They were with her now. The whispers followed Amanda relentlessly. Days passed, but she could still hear them, faint at first like a breeze brushing through the trees, but growing louder as night fell. They clung to her thoughts, distorting her reality. Every shadow became a threat, every silence deafening. Amanda stayed in East Hollow, driven by an unshakable need to uncover what had happened to her grandmother and what truly lay within the Ashwood asylum. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages from her editor, demanding updates on her article. But Amanda had no intention of submitting a polished story anytime soon. There was more to this, something unfinished, something clawing at her very sanity. She spent her nights in the small, dimly lit room she had rented at the town's lone motel. The room offered no solace. Its walls seemed to close in, the faded floral wallpaper peeling away, as if trying to escape its own existence. Amanda sat hunched over her laptop, rereading her notes on Ashwood, replaying every moment in her mind, but it only made the whispers grow louder. She realized she had taken something from the asylum that night. Not just a patient file, but something darker, intangible, a piece of Ashwood itself. On the third night, the dreams began. Amanda found herself back in the asylum, standing in its decaying corridors. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and iron. Doors slammed open and shut in the distance, and those same twisted figures crawled out of the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on her. But this time, one figure stood apart from the rest. A woman in a hospital gown, her face shrouded by long, matted hair. Amanda knew instinctively who it was. "Grandma?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The woman turned, and Amanda's heart sank. It was Ruth, but not as Amanda remembered her. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark, and her lips curled into a smile that didn't belong. "You can't run," Ruth said, her voice distorted. "It's part of you now." Amanda woke with a start, her breath coming in gasps. Sweat drenched her body, and her hands trembled as she reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. But as she brought it to her lips, she froze. The reflection in the glass wasn't hers. It was Ruth's. The glass shattered as it hit the floor, but Amanda barely noticed. She scrambled out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned toward the mirror on the wall, dreading what she might see. For a moment, it was just her, a pale, terrified version of herself. But then her reflection smiled. She hadn't smiled. The whispers surged, louder than ever, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. Amanda clamped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. "Get out of my head," she screamed, collapsing to her knees. The voices stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. Amanda looked up, and the room was no longer her motel room. She was back in the asylum, standing in the basement with its rows of metal doors. The door to the last cell creaked open slowly, revealing the man she had seen before. He smiled that grotesque smile, his hollow eyes gleaming. "You brought us back," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Now we can never leave." "No," Amanda whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This isn't real." But the man only laughed, a sound that seemed to come from all around her. "You'll see," he said. "You'll see what it means to belong to Ashwood." The floor beneath her crumbled, and Amanda fell into darkness. When Amanda woke again, she was in her motel room, but something was different. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence. She got out of bed and walked to the window. Outside, the world seemed wrong. The colors were muted, the sky a dull gray. People moved in slow motion, their faces blurred and indistinct. Amanda turned back to the room and froze. On the bed was the file she had taken from the asylum, but it wasn't as she had left it. The pages were filled with new entries, written in a scrawled, shaky hand. Amanda Parker. Admitted January 7th, 2025. Condition: paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations. Subject claims to see and hear entities from Ashwood Asylum. Her blood ran cold. The final line on the page sent a chill down her spine. Termination recommended. A knock at the door made her jump. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, just another knock, louder this time. Amanda opened the door, and the hallway outside was empty. But as she stepped back into the room, she saw it written on the wall in dripping red letters. "You can't leave." The whispers returned, louder than ever, and Amanda realized the truth. She had never left Ashwood, and now she never would. The whispers consumed her thoughts, threading themselves through every fleeting moment of silence. Like a parasite burrowing deeper, Amanda staggered backward, her gaze locked on the blood-red words on the wall, "You can't leave." Her breathing quickened, and her knees threatened to buckle. She needed to ground herself, to find some semblance of logic in the madness swirling around her. "No," she muttered, shaking her head violently. "This isn't real. It's just my mind playing tricks." But deep down, Amanda knew better. Her grandmother's warnings, the patient file, the things she had seen, none of it could be chalked up to imagination. Ashwood Asylum was no mere ruin. It was alive, pulsating with malevolent energy. and somehow Amanda had tethered herself to its dark heart. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, breaking the oppressive silence. Amanda flinched but grabbed it instinctively, desperate for some connection to the world outside her nightmare. The screen displayed an unknown number, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause, followed by the faint sound of static. Then, a voice emerged, a voice she recognized all too well. "Amanda." It was her grandmother. The tone was distorted, hollow, as if speaking from the other side of a vast chasm. "You need to listen. You've done something terrible." Amanda's grip on the phone tightened. "Grandma? What's happening? I don't understand." "You opened the door," her grandmother interrupted, her voice rising with urgency. "You let them out, Amanda. They're free now, but they're bound to you. They'll consume you unless..." The line went dead. "Unless what?" Amanda shouted, her voice cracking. "Grandma, what do I do?" The phone screen flickered, displaying a single word in large, bold letters: "Run." Amanda dropped the phone as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls warping and twisting. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching toward her like living things. A deafening crash came from the motel bathroom. Amanda spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness within. Then, something moved, a faint shimmer of light reflecting off a pair of eyes. "No," Amanda whispered, taking a step back. "Stay away." The figure emerged from the darkness, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was the man from Ashwood, the one who had spoken to her in her dreams. His face twisted into a grotesque grin as he raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "You brought us back," he said, his voice echoing as if coming from everywhere at once. "Now you'll see what it means to belong." The room dissolved around her, and Amanda found herself back in the asylum, standing in the center of the decaying basement. The air was thick with the stench of rotten mildew. The metal doors lining the walls rattled violently, as if something or someone was trying to escape. Amanda's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The man stepped closer, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. "You can't run," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're one of us now." The doors burst open, and figures began to emerge. Patients in tattered hospital gowns, their faces twisted with pain and rage, their eyes glowing with a sickly light. They moved toward her, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Amanda's breath hitched as she backed away, her mind racing. She had to get out, had to escape, but how? The asylum was a labyrinth, a trap designed to keep its victims inside forever. Her gaze fell on the patient file still clutched in her trembling hands. Flipping through the pages, she found a map of the asylum's layout. There, marked in red, was a room labeled Control Center. A faint spark of hope ignited within her. If she could make it there, maybe she could find a way to stop this madness. Amanda turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the endless corridors. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each passing second. The shadows twisted and writhed, reaching for her as she sprinted through the decaying halls. She reached the control room, slamming the door shut behind her. The room was filled with old monitors, their screens flickering with static. In the center of the room was a large lever, marked Containment Lockdown. Amanda didn't hesitate. She grabbed the lever and pulled with all her strength. The asylum shook violently, and the whispers turned into anguished screams. The shadows recoiled, and the glowing-eyed figures dissolved into mist. For a moment, everything was silent. Amanda collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. But as she looked up at the monitors, her heart sank. The screens showed her reflection dozens of versions of herself, each trapped in a different room of the asylum. And then she realized the asylum hadn't been defeated. It had just claimed her as its newest prisoner. Story 5. The first thing Henry noticed when he drove into Greystone was the quiet. Not the kind of peaceful silence you find in a sleepy town, but an eerie absence of life. The air felt heavy, and the streets were deserted. No chatter, no laughter, not even the sound of birds, just silence. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty road. Henry glanced at the GPS on his phone. The town hadn't been marked on any maps, and his phone had stopped working miles ago. Yet here he was, drawn to this forgotten place, as if some unseen force had guided him. He parked his car in front of what looked like the town square. The centerpiece was a weathered fountain, its water long dried up. Around it stood rows of buildings, houses, a general store, a diner all abandoned. Their windows were intact, but they stared at him like empty, soulless eyes. Henry stepped out of his car, his boots crunching on the cracked asphalt. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Anyone here?" No response. He walked toward the diner, hoping to find some clue as to why this town was abandoned. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, everything looked as if it had been frozen in time. Plates of food sat untouched on the tables, now hardened and covered in a thin layer of dust. A cup of coffee sat on the counter, its contents reduced to a dark stain at the bottom. Henry's stomach churned. It was as if everyone had just vanished. "Maybe they evacuated," he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. There were no signs of a struggle, no warnings, no indication of why this place was left behind. As he turned to leave, he spotted something on the wall behind the counter, a photograph. It showed a group of people standing in front of the diner, smiling. There was a man who looked like the owner, a waitress in her uniform, and several customers. But what caught Henry's attention was a figure in the background. It was blurred, almost as if it didn't belong in the picture. A tall, dark silhouette with no discernible features. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He stepped closer, squinting at the photo. The longer he stared, the more unsettling the figure became. It seemed to lean forward, as if watching him. The air grew colder, and a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Henry froze, his eyes darting around the room. The tapping grew louder, coming from somewhere outside. He stepped back into the square, his breath visible in the now freezing air. The tapping was coming from the fountain. Henry approached cautiously, his pulse pounding in his ears. A single drop of water fell from the fountain's spout, splashing into the dry basin below. Then another, and another. The fountain, which had been bone-dry moments ago, was now filling with water. But it wasn't clear water, it was thick, black, and tar-like. The sight of it made Henry's stomach turn. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he turned around. The square was no longer empty. People stood in the shadows, lining the edges of the square. Their heads were bowed, their faces obscured. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "Hello?" Henry said, his voice trembling. "Who are you? What happened here?" The figures didn't respond, but slowly they began to raise their heads. Henry took a step back, his body trembling. Their faces were raw and hollow, featureless masks of pale flesh, and their eyes, black, bottomless pits, seemed to suck the light out of the world around them. The tapping sound returned, louder and more insistent. Henry turned back to the fountain. The black liquid was now overflowing, spilling onto the ground and creeping toward him like a living thing. Panic set in. Henry ran back to his car, fumbling with the keys as the figures began to move. Their steps were slow, deliberate, and utterly silent. He could feel their eyes on him, even though they had no eyes at all. He jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. The car roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as he sped down the empty street, leaving the town square behind. But the further he drove, the stranger things became. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on itself. No matter how far he went, he always ended up back in the square. The figures were still there, waiting, their numbers growing with each pass. Henry screamed in frustration, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. "What do you want from me?" The radio crackled to life, startling him. A voice, distorted and barely audible, spoke through the static. "You shouldn't have come." The car sputtered and died, its engine refusing to start again. Henry looked up to see the figures standing in a circle around the car, closer than ever. The black liquid from the fountain was spreading across the ground, seeping toward him like an inevitable tide. Henry scrambled out of the car, running toward the edge of town. He didn't care where he was going, he just needed to get away. But no matter how far he ran, the town stretched on, endless and unchanging. Finally, his legs gave out and he collapsed to the ground. The figures closed in, their hollow faces inches from his own. The black liquid pooled around him, swallowing everything in its path. As the darkness consumed him, Henry heard a whisper, soft, cold, and inescapable. "You belong to us now." The next morning, Greystone was as silent as ever. The streets were empty, the fountain dry, and in the diner, a new photograph hung on the wall. It showed a man standing in the square, his face frozen in terror, as shadowy figures loomed behind him. As the photograph of Henry's last moments hung on the diner wall, the town of Greystone seemed unchanged. The streetlights flickered dimly in the distance, casting eerie shadows over the cracked sidewalks. But the truth was far from the facade of a normal, forgotten town. A sinister energy hummed beneath the surface, a cold, suffocating force that permeated every corner of the town. For months, no one had ventured into Greystone, and the town had quietly absorbed the silence left by Henry and the others who had vanished before him. The figures, those faceless, eerie entities, remained constant, their presence undisturbed, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon the town and fall into their grasp. And then came Jessie. She wasn't like Henry. Jessie had no reason to be afraid of ghost stories or haunted towns. She was curious, adventurous, and most of all, skeptical. It was her thirst for adventure and her need to prove to herself that the supernatural didn't exist that led her here. She had heard the rumors about Greystone, the ghost town that no one could find on a map, the place where people disappeared, where time seemed to fold into itself. But Jessie, a self-proclaimed skeptic, thought it was all just exaggerated stories told to scare children. When she found an old journal at an antique shop detailing the mysterious disappearances, she was intrigued, but not scared. "I'll go there," she told herself. "I'll see for myself, and then I'll show everyone that it's just a myth." The journey there was long, the roads dark and twisted, but Jessie pressed on. The air grew heavier as she approached the town. The dense trees surrounding the road seemed to lean in closer, blocking out the sky, casting a shadow over everything. The deeper she drove into the woods, the colder it became. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the chilling wind whispered through the trees. When she finally entered the town, Jessie didn't notice the unusual silence immediately. She was too focused on the strange feeling that had settled over her, an unsettling sense that the world around her had changed, that something wasn't quite right. As she parked her car in front of the diner, she glanced around. The town was deserted, as the journal had described, but it didn't feel like an abandoned town. No, it felt like a place that was waiting for someone to arrive, waiting for something to happen. Jessie walked into the diner, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The door creaked as she entered, the sudden sound startling her. The air inside was thick with dust, and everything seemed frozen in time. Plates of food lay untouched on the tables, their contents stale and hard. A cup of coffee, long cold, sat on the counter. And in the corner, the photograph of the smiling townspeople, with that strange blurred figure in the background, caught her eye. Jessie's curiosity got the better of her. She stepped closer to examine the photo. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the figure in the background. It was almost as if it were a shadow, its features indistinct and wavering. The more she looked at it, the more she felt like it was watching her. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She turned around quickly, but no one was there. Just the empty, hollow diner, silent as ever. But then, from outside, a faint sound reached her ears, a tapping, slow and deliberate, echoing in the distance. She hesitated, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. "It's just the wind," she muttered to herself. "It's just the wind." But something in the back of her mind told her that it wasn't the wind. She stepped cautiously toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The tapping grew louder, and she found herself drawn toward it, compelled to investigate. There was a pull, an invisible force urging her to go to the fountain in the center of town. Outside, the atmosphere had shifted. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. The fountain, once dry, was now filled with dark water, its surface rippling as if disturbed by something beneath. Jessie felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Then she saw them. The figures. They stood in the distance, like dark shapes moving in the periphery of her vision. At first, they were just shadows, indistinct and blurry. But as she moved closer, they became clearer, tall, gaunt figures with featureless faces. Their eyes, if they had any, were deep, hollow voids, like black holes that threatened to swallow everything around them. Jessie's breath caught in her throat, and her heart raced. She tried to turn and run, but her legs felt heavy, as if something was anchoring her to the ground. A voice, low, guttural, and barely a whisper, drifted to her ears. It was impossible to tell where it came from, but it seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding her. "Don't run, stay with us." Jessie's stomach twisted in fear. She had heard stories of haunted towns, of ghostly figures, but this felt different. This wasn't a ghost story, it was real, and she was caught in its grip. She backed away slowly, her eyes locked on the figures as they began to move toward her. Their steps slow and deliberate. They weren't walking, they were gliding, hovering just above the ground, and with each step they took, the air grew colder. The black liquid in the fountain began to spill over, creeping toward her, its surface writhing and shifting like a living creature. Desperately, Jessie turned and ran, her feet pounding the pavement as she raced toward her car. But as she reached for the door, she realized it was locked. She tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged within her, and she began to scream, banging on the window, shouting for help. But no one answered. The town was silent once again, and the figures, ever closer, reached out with their dark, skeletal hands, their fingers elongated and twisting like vines. They touched the car, and Jessie felt a cold, suffocating pressure against her chest. "Stay with us," they whispered again, their voices melding into a single, haunting chorus. With one final, desperate scream, Jessie felt herself being pulled from the car, her body dragged toward the center of town, toward the fountain, toward the waiting darkness. The town of Greystone had claimed another soul, and the photograph on the wall of the diner was updated once more. This time, it was Jessie, her terrified face frozen in time, surrounded by the faceless figures.